CT 169 Throng presents a legislative roundup to the 2024 Connecticut General Assembly, moderated by CT 169 Throng President and Fairfield Planning and Zoning Commissioner, Alexis Harrison, joined by CT 169 Strong co-founder and New Canaan Board of Finance and Affordable Housing Committee member, Maria Weingarten, and fellow Fairfield Planning and Zoning Commissioner and Environmental Attorney, Catherine Braun, along with Honorable Connecticut State Senators, Jeff Gordon and Ryan Fazio.
All right, good evening, everybody. Alexis Harrison here with CT 169 Strong. I feel like it's been a while since we all talked, even though the session just ended a few weeks ago. I want to welcome you to our legislative wrap-up. We have an awesome panel of guests, as always, who lend their time and expertise. So we're very grateful for Senator Fazio, who is the ranking member of the Planning and Development Committee. He represents Greenwich, Stamford, and New Canaan in the Senate. We have Senator Jeffrey Gordon, who is just finishing up your first term and has served on the Planning and Zoning Commission in his hometown of Woodstock for many years, 16 years, I believe, and is now serving the Northeast corner, the quiet corner. We have Maria Weingarten, CT 169 co-founder and a Board of Finance member, and holds a number of other titles. And last but not least, Catherine Braun, who's an environmental attorney, as well as a planning and zoning commissioner in Fairfield, who I am lucky enough to serve with. So I'm going to turn it over to the senators. Maybe Senator Fazio, you want to go first since you are on P&D. And you can give us kind of a quick overview of what happened. I know it was a short session, but a lot happened, a lot of bills. So please give us a snapshot of that.
Yeah. Thanks for having this panel, and I think it's good to look back. I think this was overall one of the better legislative sessions we've had for housing and zoning issues in a while. I think we passed some good legislation that will put communities in the driver's seat while also advancing kind of housing goals towards more affordability and increased housing stock, but with communities closer to the driver's seat than we've seen in the past. I think the highlights are obviously that House Bill 5474 passed into law, and that was a large housing bill that I think had some good provisions and some negative provisions in it. But on the whole, it was a difficult call to vote for it or not. I voted for it. I know Senator Gordon voted against it, but we probably had a lot of the same opinions about the different subsets and provisions in the bill. And there was, again, some good and some bad. And there's both good reasons to vote for it and against it. And if we actually had to vote on the individual provisions in the law individually, then we would probably have a very similar votes on that. But sometimes these are difficult calls. At the same time, House Bill 5390 did not pass. That was the Transit-Oriented Development Work, Live, Ride bill. Basically, it would push municipalities to adopt as of right zoning in transit districts, so areas around bus or train stations. But ultimately approved, that plan would have to be approved by the state government bureaucracy, OPM. And if that was approved, they would be eligible for priority funding under several buckets of funding, hundreds of millions of dollars a year. All those buckets add up to. If they do not adopt that funding, then they would be deprioritized for those funding buckets. Ultimately, I was opposed to it. Senator Gordon and I had filed 16 amendments, I think, on the last day of session. We planned to debate it a long time if it was called on the floor, and ultimately it wasn't, in part because of that message that we telegraphed. And so it did not pass into law, which I think was a good thing. And then there were some other smaller bills related to housing and zoning that passed that I think were positive. In the school construction and bonding bill, there was a provision that changes some of the building codes to mirror what's more normal in Europe and across the world, that for kind of small multifamily, medium-sized multifamily, that there only needs to be one stairwell instead of multiple stairwells. That can make housing less expensive, which I think is a positive. And that had bipartisan buy-in. We talked about that on the Majority Leaders Task Force in the offseason. And then a bill that I co-authored, the Senate Bill 333, that will return rights to municipalities to make decisions about their planning and zoning commissions in their town or city charter. That was taken away without a public hearing back in 2023. And I think that was met with widespread opposition from municipalities across the state. People were surprised by it. People on both parties were opposed to it. Some people were in favor of it. Obviously, it passed into law, so it had some friends. But we were able, through the kind of open debate public hearing process, to pass Senate Bill 333 this year, which repeals parts of that law and gives towns and cities the ability to make changes to their planning and zoning commissions and some changes to eminent domain and disposition of property through their town and city charter once again. So I think for those reasons, some of the provisions of 5474, which give towns more flexibility to meet affordable housing goals, and a moratorium under 830G, some other changes that will reduce costs and make the housing a little more affordable. Senate Bill 333 passing, all those things are positives. And I think House Bill 5390, the Work, Live, Ride Transit-Oriented Development Bill, not passing, are positives. There are some negatives in 5474, however, and we obviously are still dealing with the overhang of things like 830G. We're still dealing with the specter in the future of more heavy-handed mandates passing, like fair share and others. So, we have to remain vigilant. I know that's why 169 Strong's here. We as legislators need to be remain vigilant and in years to come in order to protect things like local control and home rule, while also improving our housing markets, making the housing market more affordable and accessible as well. So it's a challenging topic, but I think this was the first year in many years we actually saw some slight positive progress.
That's great. Thank you for that wonderful synopsis. You're always on the hot seat first because of being the ranking member of P&D. That's very helpful. I do want to turn to Senator Gordon. You mentioned that when we were first chatting tonight that you saw some missed opportunity this session. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, happy to. And, I agree with what Senator Fazio had to say. I think there were some good things done. There were certainly some things that raised a lot of concern that we were trying to work on to stop some of the bad things from hitting municipalities, especially small towns, but see what we can do constructively to make things better. And even though like a big bill 5474 had some good things in it, because of my concern about what it might do wresting control away from local decision making, I ultimately voted against it and spoke to that specifically on the Senate floor. But it was a short session, so it's interesting in this short session, so much was crammed in to be done by committees and then trying to get out to the House and the Senate while at the same time wrestling with a big budget change that ended up by a majority vote getting enacted. It was just, I think a lot was taken and just couldn't all go through. And I think there were some missed opportunities for certain bills that I thought could make some steps in a good direction, opportunities to raise amendments and perhaps change for the better some legislation, big and small. It just didn't make the full House and Senate calendar. Not everything that went into one chamber made it to the other. Some never even made it. There was so much that was trying to be done in a short session. So yes, I think there were some missed opportunities and some things where there were amendments raised and things offered in a bipartisan effort, but just were shot down. Some of it by party vote, majority party vote. But we have next session, which is a longer session. So hopefully there'll be another opportunity to raise some things and really think through some things with some more thought and care. But also, which I said a lot at times during the session, engaging more and more those who are going to have to deal with this at the grassroots level, which are planning and zoning commissions, other commissions like inland wetlands and watercourse agencies, conservation commissions, and the people in their towns, and really make a bigger effort. We do have to be very vigilant. The quote-unquote fair share is still out there. I know every now and then I remind the OPM secretary that I'm monitoring it. Just reached out this week again for another update, and so we'll see when that comes back. But we do have to be vigilant and use this time in between sessions to continue to work with people, and hopefully others will want to work in a bipartisan way to really see what we can do constructively, as opposed to just trying to throw something out and see if you can make it stick by majority vote. So there was some good and bad, but I'm not discouraged. I think there's more we can do in the
Yeah.
future.
Can you just you touched on fair share, and that was phase one was adopted last session. Can you just give an overview of what that is for people who may not know?
Well, at this point in time, with quote unquote fair share, it was an effort to say that you had a whole bunch of quote unquote, affordable housing that you need throughout the state, and then by county or region, and then divvy it up amongst all the municipalities. Not necessarily a realistic formula especially when you're given, say, rural or small towns that have no infrastructure or ability to even financially try to support a lot of this, or having local jobs for people to even move in and get. Right now, it's a study or a task force or a working group, which really, as was discussed last year during the session, and I voted against it, is just a way to say that you're going to get what I think is a biased group of people together, spending a lot of taxpayer money to do this, by the way. I'm tracking that. And then come back with saying, well, this group is coming up with more or less what we've already tried to enact last year. But now we have experts saying it in a working group. But that's a top-down approach, and it doesn't really work. And when this was discussed last year, there were a number of amendments and discussions to try to upgrade and improve 830G. But a lot of that just got shot down. So we just have to be vigilant and really make certain we're watching this stuff and see what really then comes out through Planning and Development Committee, Housing Committee, and then certainly, how much push there is for this politically.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and thank you again for all the advocacy that you do on behalf of Connecticut. Maria, I know you are just an incredible advocate for Connecticut as well, and really are a terrific monitor of everything going on. Do you want to I know Senator Fazio gave us an overview, but what were some other bills that CT 169 followed this year? Just give us an overview as well, because I know there were some pretty concerning bills that we tracked.
Right. So SB 207, that was the Housing Authority Jurisdiction Bill. And I think that there was also bipartisan opposition to that from the more moderate caucus of Democrats as well, that bill would not work. So the idea in that one, there were two versions of that bill that went forward. One that would have just allowed a housing authority to build in another town without permission, and then a second bill that included it that said that you would have to get permission from the other town. So that was, the concern there is that we you want to make sure that towns are able to build, and if they want to reach out, and there are communities, I believe Fairfield is one of them, right, Alexis, that does work with a neighboring community to build affordable, and that's great if that's how you decide that works for your community, and that's a collaborative process, as we always talk about. It's so important to have all of the stakeholders engaged and involved, and that's what we hope to see. So there was that bill, a lot of as of right legislation, so a lot of bills that were just trying to force as of right development,
And what does that mean to the average person as of right?
so as of right, meaning that you should have a town that gets together, creates their form-based code, that creates a whole layout of what's allowed to be built, and should have considered every possible scenario for development, and then have a public hearing on that and make sure everyone's on board, and then have those in place such that any developer coming in with and we're talking here more about larger projects. So that's really what they were trying to push here, is the idea that larger projects can be just developed as of right. So it's one thing if you have single family housing where you have a zoning in an area where there's only septic, and sort of zoning helps take care of that to make sure that you're not having over densification, and that your land can support the septic that you might need for a development on a specific plot of land. But when you're talking about all the different iterations of a multifamily or a development project or a mixed use project, the idea that you can't just engage with your local planning and zoning committee, your inland wetlands, and all those other resources that you have to make sure that it checks all the boxes and make sure that everything is is good right from the start, you could run into some serious issues with development, with flooding, with inland wetlands. Like there are so many issues that can come up. And so the thought is that a special permit process is really not special. It happens every day and things get passed every day. And I think we have to get away from this concept of picking out, worst case scenarios of things not happening and not progressing in our state when there's plenty of development that happens without, just through the normal process within their communities. So,
Yeah.
so that's,
And I just had a question because, we see this a lot on Twitter and, other social media venues. They say CT 169, not in favor of housing, not in favor of TOD. You want to just dispel that for us?
100%. We are pro development in terms of working with everyone, collaborating with everyone. We want smart development, smart growth. That's growth that's manageable, that's sustainable, that accounts for the fact that you might have narrow roads in one community or limited sewer access or whatever those different unique circumstances that make each of our 169 towns different, should be acknowledged and should be able to be addressed. And the best ones to address those are the ones who live in the communities because they are accountable. They're the ones you see in your supermarket, on the street, in your town, and they're the ones who you're going to hold accountable, not some nameless bureaucrat up in Hartford pushing down a one-size-fits-all state mandated rule, and then, or even as the latest version of 5390 would have allowed the ability for an unnamed yet surrogate to make all those decisions, a consultant. So those are all very concerning things, and we hold our we have responsibility. We take ownership of what we do in our communities, and that's the way it should work.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I want to turn to Kathy because this is actually a perfect segue to Kathy. And it looks like you're in a beautiful spot tonight. Talk about, you're the environmental person, and you talk a lot about some of the harmful, implications of some of the bills. And you wrote, a really extensive piece on 5390, the
Yeah.
transit-oriented development bill. Do you want to talk about those concerns and just how important zoning is when it comes to the environment and protection?
Yeah, if you don't, first of all, 5390 didn't only attack site-specific project review, it also attacked the planning role of some towns have a combined town plan and zoning commission, some have separate, but the planning role is there also. And it would have attacked that because once you opt in, which of course is a coercive opt-in, then you can try to plan the footprint of the TOD, you can try to pass regulations and zones within the TOD, but it's all subject to a state public official overview and they have final decision. And then aside from that, when you do the project review, there would be no zoning discretion whatsoever. And anyone who's ever gone to a public hearing knows that is their chance to say, this road is different than the road down, 5 minutes away, even though it's in the same district. Every parcel of land is different. Every project is different. The impacts are different. It could be affected by the fact that there's no sidewalks. It's very narrow. The project would create congestion that could be unsafe, even if it satisfies the checklist of what your form-based code might allow within that district. And from an environmental perspective, without having a public hearing, I don't know if you could file a 22A-19 environmental intervention, which has been around for 50 plus years. And because there's no proceeding to intervene into, you have to intervene into a proceeding to raise environmental issues. So that is the Connecticut Environmental Protection Act that it's a remedial act that has basically said anyone in the state or any organization, any group, any individual can intervene into any type of administrative proceeding to raise environmental issues. That was of great concern. And another issue, that's many of the bills that had as of right development, but many other bills also seem to be trying to start attacking wetlands, historic review, design review, and things like that. That's very concerning because all these bills are extremely slanted or weighted towards multifamily development. Many of them eliminated public hearings. Some of them tried to eliminate the ability to appeal a wetlands decision by saying you have to live next door and show actual harm. Some of them said you could not file an environmental intervention unless you live next door and could show actual harm to your property. That's not the purpose of wetlands laws. Wetlands laws are remedial. They're to protect the environment, not your property next door. So the attempted rollback, I'm so relieved that these bills didn't pass. The attempted rollback, it will come back, and that's of great concern because we need to be preserving more open space, not less. And open space that's not already protected by a deed, an easement, a wetlands, district or something like that, that would be up for grabs in any of these bills. And once you lose open space, you lose all the ecological services it provides. I can go into more detail if somebody wants to know, but it provides a lot of space. When it's gone forever, along with all the ecological services it provides.
Okay, great. So I want to just, this is an open question for the group. I was actually talking to an urban planner this weekend. He works in New York City. He grew up in Fairfield County, and he was kind of astonished to hear that there was this big attempt to build all this density in the suburbs. And I guess his question is, what's going to happen to the cities? Is that why are, I think most of us would think, and I know Governor Lamont has said this, we need to be investing in the cities. So what will happen to the cities if we build all this massive density in our suburbs, which don't really have the infrastructure to support it necessarily?
Well, that's an extremely important question, and I know I and others raise this because if you're going to really push a lot of this housing, especially higher density housing, for example, saying commercial buildings can become as of right residential. There was a bill about that included nursing homes that are no longer in use, which can be big facilities going to multifamily as of right. That's a real concern. I never got any real answers last session in this session about where is going to be the state investment when you're talking about outside of the cities and even outside of the suburbs, for example, big parts of Connecticut that have no real infrastructure, don't have public water, don't have public sewer, don't have the local jobs, don't have real public transit to any degree. Unless you're going to really spend a lot of money and invest in the affordable housing, or what I call housing affordability, just not the strict criteria for affordable housing, but what we really look at on planning and zoning commissions about true affordability in a community, then just trying to build it isn't going to work. And in fact, one of the questions I've been asking and never got a good answer is, if you're going to try to build all this and you don't have those services that people are going to need or the jobs that they're looking for, why would they even move? They're going to stay where they are. So this is why a lot of this stuff, top-down approach, doesn't work. It's not, and I'm glad you mentioned earlier that, CT 169 strong, all of us as well, who have been talking on these issues, we're not opposed to housing at all. We're just saying the top-down approach by the bureaucrats who don't know the towns does not work. You really need to upgrade and improve 830G because it's not working and partner with the towns. And you got to think about these things. I've challenged people, come out to any of my 13 towns in Northeast Connecticut that I proudly represent, and I'll walk you around and show you why no one's opposed to housing. It's just can't be done on a large scale. But none of those folks take me up on that offer. But I'm happy to show them, and that's really where you learn, not just a map, but out there really walking around and in the field. So I think what will happen is if it really gets pushed, it's going to fall apart. The towns, the suburbs will get blamed, and unfairly so. And that helps nobody looking for housing affordability. And that's the real crux of it. We really should work to see what to do about housing affordability.
Interesting.
And I think it's one of the things that we've always talked about is how Fairfield County, because of its proximity to New York, it seems to be very much the target of a lot of developers because they're like, oh, because people are coming out of New York and they can go there and they can make a lot more profit there. So there's such a push to densification in an area that's already quite dense. And it's concerning and it's interesting because I've started looking at RPA, I guess, has a fourth plan. And it's not just Fairfield County and New Haven County, which I guess, you can understand that because there's transit on those lines, but they're also looking at Litchfield County And I was sort of scratching my head and saying, why are they looking in an area that does not have transit, does not have any real sewer to speak of? And I'm just, and then it's interesting because then I found another map that showed pricing and the values are higher in Litchfield County. And I was like, okay, that's it. It's all about the dollars. At least that's where it appears, unless we hear differently. That to me is the only thing I could come up with that makes sense as to why they're looking at these three counties, Fairfield, New Haven, and then Litchfield. I'm like, there's no transit there.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the Lamont administration, there was a question about significantly or aiming to significantly increase the population of Connecticut cities, because their view was that Connecticut cities were too small to see substantial growth in the state. And there's probably some truth to that, that if you look at other states, they have major cities, and Connecticut doesn't have a major city. It has these small cities, with Bridgeport and Stamford and New Haven at around 130, 140,000 people being the biggest. And so there was some sense that the scaling is easier to do in a New Haven or a Bridgeport, where you don't just have transit, but you have mixed use. And having residential and mixed use areas is really probably where it makes more sense than simply having it in a transit area. I think one of the flaws of the transit-oriented development proposals is that there's no mixed use component. Yes, you have access to a transit station, but there's a lot of transit stations around Fairfield County, for instance, and elsewhere around the state where there's not actually mixed use, there's not actually retail, there's not actually grocery stores, and so on. And so, it's not a very pleasant experience riding a train 15 minutes with a giant inventory of groceries back and forth. Having the walkability is probably what makes a city a livable place. And so you can only do that with scale. You can't turn a medium-sized town into that sort of mixed-use scale without a Soviet-style 5 or 10-year plan. So the amount of coercion that would be necessary to create that sort of end goal, would make people probably sneeze at fair share. So there was a sense at the beginning of the Lamont administration that maybe there's some cases where we can scale certain parts of cities in a way that would have local buy-in as well. And I think that, to this day is, kind of lost on our conversation, that it's not just about transit, it's not just about one thing or another, but the areas that you put more housing does matter, and whether the nuances of that neighborhood or community lend themselves to more housing is a relevant question, and mixed use is probably the primary example of that. And these decisions are probably, with some state guidance, need to be nuanced and made at a local level. So I think the idea that you're going to replace the cities with better suburbs, or you're going to replace the small cities with larger suburbs or other small cities, leaves Connecticut cities in a difficult position. What happened to them? Are they going to be able to share and experience an economic growth, or is it just going to be towns that are being imposed upon really by these state mandates? And I think the evidence that over the past 15 or 20 years, the problem has not been zoning as much as it has been lack of general economic growth, is evidence in the lack of population growth in the cities, the falling rents in many of the cities, especially Hartford, especially Waterbury, especially New London, probably to a lesser extent Bridgeport and New Haven. So this is also dovetails into the conversation that the reason we have lacking affordability is for many reasons. It's because in recent years the general national housing market has increased, has tightened as there's more demand for residential as opposed to other forms of real estate. Materials and labor have increased, and there's some ways policy can address those things, but not that many ways. But also we have problems with high energy costs. We have problems with high property taxes that are to a large extent the product of state mandates. When Connecticut has second or third highest property taxes in the country, how can it be affordable? Those are regressive taxes. And there was actually a part of 5474 that might actually make property taxes a little bit less regressive in Connecticut. Maybe that was a positive thing. There's probably some Republicans who disagreed with me on that, but I think that was an okay thing. So I just, we don't want to lose the cities. We need growth in the cities. We shouldn't aim to turn the towns into small cities and at the expense of the existing cities. I think on the ground knowledge can lend itself to better policy outcomes here, and we shouldn't lose the nuances, and we shouldn't leave the cities behind either.
And there's a
Right.
symbiotic relationship there. I mean, we all go to the cities, for whatever we go to, whether it's entertainment or shopping or whatever we need to do. And there are so many things that are provided in a city that aren't necessarily in a small town. So it's a, a environment where we all can benefit. So it's important that we support all of that together. It's an all of the above has to be the solution, but that's the whole idea, is that we need nuanced solutions. You can't just have an urban centric solution like what RPA has generally put out, which is very urbanization centric, versus what can be managed in a small rural or small town. It's very different.
Yeah. And I would just want to add, I think I read a study today where basically that's saying the transit industry is in a crisis. Ridership is at a low. It's very expensive for most people. So how is a TOD going to be beneficial to people if the central mechanism doesn't really work? I can't really take a train from my house to go visit a friend in Fairfield. So I guess how does this idea really play out in reality?
It's forcing a commuter rail to act as a local mass transit. And the reality is that the cost is so high that it's not as affordable, and the service is not frequent. And it's a very high capital intensive to have those transit trains. So it's a challenging scenario. And I think Margarita Alban talked about it. And as Brian had mentioned before, the idea that it may not be as a focus on transit per se, but more on the idea of communities and being able to create a little bit more densification around communities versus this larger density that they're trying to push, which is just all high density rental units in taller buildings. And that's just not going to work everywhere. And I think that's again, we need nuanced solutions. We don't need what's been out there. And I think a good start would be to stop always talking to just the housing advocates. And as Jeff was saying, like, you need to start talking to these local planning and zoning and these local committees, because they're the ones who know what makes their community unique. And they're the ones that the state should be working with arm in arm, not with the housing advocates who have an agenda and who are backed by these larger developer interests. So, and their agenda is very different than what might work well for smaller towns.
And
Yeah.
just one quick thing about the smaller towns, and I'm not opposed to seeing what we can do realistically and responsibly for housing affordability. But for example, for smaller towns that have no transit, let alone anything that would even be called a transit-oriented district. Some of the towns don't even have downtowns. And to say that, sure, they're not going to opt in because they have no transit-oriented district at all, but yet then they get penalized. If you really look at what was being proposed, they could be deprioritized. I know some people saying that's not the case, but if you're going to prioritize some towns and not others, some are actually deprioritized. That's the plain fact. There's no other word to describe it. And that's unfair. So you're right, we have to take nuanced approaches. What will work in the cities, the suburbs, and the rural parts of the state are very different. And we need to be looking at that. And this is why when you have some of these bills that are kind of a one-size-fits-all top-down approach, I view that as a missed opportunity. And in fact, you can create a lot of foreseeable adverse consequences that you then have to spend time trying to fix. We should actually be taking the time thinking it through and seeing what can work best in the different parts of the state, and then try to go accordingly. And that might take several different types of bills. as opposed to one gigantic bill. But it's worth doing that if people really want to see about housing affordability. That's an approach that I would take. And even in my own district, I have a town of 781 people, and then I have a town of 24,000, 25,000. Two very different towns. One clearly has public transit and the ability to put a lot of housing in. The other one, you can walk 10 miles and never see your neighbor in a small town. So very different scenarios. You can't apply the same rule to both of them.
Yeah, thank you. We do have some questions from our audience, several of them. And one is on 830G, obviously the elephant that's always in the room. Why, maybe someone could touch on why the math will never work. And I know Senator Fozzie, you've done a lot of work on 830G, trying to get it modified, and you've been successful in some cases. So we want to talk about that.
One of the reasons that it's so difficult to reach 10% is because most of the 830G development occurs with the quote unquote inclusionary zoning 830G set aside development. So you have private developers who under 830G are able to come in and build while avoiding local zoning. And the reason they're able to do so is 30% of their development is a quote unquote deed restricted affordable units. So the way that they're able to make that calculate with a positive return on investment, they're obviously for-profit developers, is that there's greater density. It's a larger scale than a lot of development in the area, but 30% of it's deed restricted. The problem is that 70% of it is not. Obviously, that's what enables them to do it profitably. While also meeting kind of the provisions of the 830G statute. So 70% not profitable, or sorry, 70% market rate or a higher income means that you're more slowly getting towards 10% than if it's 100% affordable. So I think the real problem with 830G, from the perspective of someone who might want to see more affordable units built or more units built generally, especially workforce housing or middle income housing, is that as a town, if you allow anything to be built that isn't either deed restricted housing or government housing, you actually get farther and farther away from your 10% requirement. So even though a lot of us would like to see a lot of this workforce or middle income housing built, more for teachers, more for firefighters, more for kind of local employees with middle incomes, younger families, that's really disincentivized under 830G, because as a town, you want to get to the 10% because you want your local zoning ordinances to apply because you created them, right? It's a local democratic decision. But if you allow anything other than government housing or deed restricted affordable housing, it actually brings you farther and farther away from the 10%. Because it's a ratio, it's not a fixed number. So one of the things that I propose every year is to make the denominator a fixed number. So you're not actually penalizing towns when they do make the decision that we want this workforce housing, we want this middle income housing, we want these kind of units that are in the scale and in the style of the neighborhoods and can meet the infrastructure, or the infrastructure can meet those that added demand. But under 830G, it creates this all or nothing adversarial scenario where the only, a lot of the building that occurs is very high stakes and adversarial. It's the developers making a threat under 830G, a very, very outsized dense development. And ultimately, either that passing under 830G or the town making a compromise for something else that is very dense. But the town has little incentive or less incentive under the law to add the kind of middle income housing, the workforce housing, because they're actually penalized under the 830G calculations for it. The denominator increases, but the numerator doesn't, and you get farther and farther away from 10%, even though whether it's us or Open Communities Alliance or Desegregate Connecticut, we probably all agree that building that middle income housing that the locality supports would be a good thing. So these are the ways in which, grand schemes, state mandates, one size fits all solutions actually have unintended consequences and make almost everybody unhappy. And which is why taking a reformer's viewpoint and into solving problems rather than a revolutionary's attitude towards solving problems will actually make more people happy, everyone happy, even people who might have different priorities. And that's, I think, one of the main ways in which 830G fails. It fails communities and neighborhoods, and it also fails at sometimes building housing that we all want to see happen.
Kathy, do you want to add anything? I know you've been studying 830G for many years.
Yeah, so one thing I learned in my studies over the last 10 years of 8-30G, I went up to Hartford and met with somebody, a public official, basically a bureaucrat who helped craft it 35 years ago. And he said they picked 10%. It was kind of arbitrary. They just wanted to exempt the bigger cities and the poorer cities, the cities, mostly cities that already had 10% from the onerous draconian burden shifting aspect of 8-30G. And what that means is when you do a regular appeal, if you don't like what your zoning board did and you don't like it, the burden's on you to prove they abuse their discretion. But that gets flipped in an 8-30G, and that's the main feature that enables this to take place, because the zoning board can't turn it down because they have the burden. They don't turn down bad projects usually because they have the burden of proof when it goes on appeal. That's the reverse of any other type of agency. So they wanted to exempt the bigger and the poor cities from that bad aspect of 8-30G, and they just picked 10%. So obviously the larger cities and the poor cities already had a lot of housing projects and they had 10%. So this number has been bandied around like it's a mandate. It's really just an exemption amount. It exempts the people, the cities that had 10% 35 years ago. And basically, honestly, the same about, Maria, you can correct me if I'm wrong, around 17% of all the municipalities in our state had 10% 35 years ago. And this basically the same ones still have it now, and none others do. Our economic development director has told us, and he's the one who tracks this, we will not see 10% in Fairfield in our lifetime. It's almost based on what Senator Fazio said, it's a mathematical impossibility by how it's structured. But also, you can't ask towns that didn't have a lot of public housing built when the law was passed to suddenly expand. We would have had to add thousands of units when we only add maybe 90 new units a year. It's an impossibility, and we should not be judged based on that. And we are judged based on that. That's just one of many, many issues with 8-30G.
Right. There's 29 towns, I think, right now that have that 10% number, and it's declining because as more development occurs, that 10% threshold goes up in larger municipalities as well. And so they're the ones who the federal government gave those housing vouchers to. And so many of those towns, if they didn't have the housing vouchers, they wouldn't have 10% either. And many of those larger cities also had a lot of money provided to them by the state to create all of the housing development that occurred in Hartford, Waterbury, New Haven. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars on projects. Sometimes two projects would be $50 million. So, it's an astounding amount of money that went to a limited number of cities, and that's concentrated where they've lived, where anybody who needed this sort of housing lived. And then you add on that housing authorities can sometimes create constraints on and rules on voucher programs and things that they have that prevent mobility, which is also a problem. So I think it's sort of compounded on itself, and that's one of the things that really needs to get sorted out. And I'm not sure that everybody in the legislature has the stomach to do that. So that's one of the bigger issues out there.
And one other
Yeah.
quick thing that may dovetail on that is it's not as if you can build it and people will come. There's that mentality out there. It doesn't work that way. And this is part of a bigger picture. I know Senator Fazio commented upon this earlier, is housing affordability is not just what 830G says. In fact, I can tell you when I helped deal with affordable housing plans in my town and looked at ways we could deal with true housing affordability, including for people who wouldn't necessarily meet 830G criteria for housing, but otherwise meet the United Way Alice criteria, who do struggle and do need help, especially hardworking people trying to raise families. There are ways to get at that, but housing isn't a vacuum. It exists where you need to be in this state creating more jobs. That's supporting the businesses that do that, really the small businesses in all the communities. Good paying jobs, jobs that have good benefits. You want to be able to have the communities that you're supporting the public school system so people want to move there and be there. You know, the public infrastructure to support this all the roads that have to be dealt with, you know, even public transportation. I know in Northeast Connecticut, we're looking to see what we might be able to do with the federal government to expand public transportation in small towns, but also the very high cost of living that quite frankly saps a lot of money away from people to be able to afford starting homes or small homes or things like that, especially out in areas where it's not necessarily a big apartment building or, you know, things or rows of townhouses. So it's part of a bigger picture, but just saying we're going to build it in every single town, you'll find that a lot of people won't go to it. And in fact, a lot of developers don't want to build unless they're going to get a big return on the investment, which mostly in some parts of the state means the state has to actually subsidize it. And is that what the state really wants to do versus trying to find a better system to really truly sustain better housing affordability? Those are the discussions that should be had. And quite frankly, this short session we just had, there was no time to even delve into a lot of that stuff in a meaningful discussion. So this takes some time, but it's a lot of moving parts, and we have to recognize that.
Yeah, I do. We do have another question because I know we've looked back on the past session, but there are some folks here who want to talk about 2025. What are the threats from fair share that we should be aware of, and what else could possibly be on the horizon?
Anything and everything. For one, you'll have reports back on what the fair share, quote unquote, calculation is from, is it the Office of Responsible Growth in the Office of Policy and Management. So, you know, the whole idea of fair share phase one is that you're creating the bureaucracy and you're creating the calculations that might ultimately result in a fair share proposal passing into law. And all of these other proposals that we've discussed, the housing authority jurisdiction beyond municipal borders, the work, live, ride, transit oriented development requirements, and so on and so forth. All of these proposals have been back in year after year, and so there's no reason to expect that they won't be next year. And so, we'll have to try to propose things that are superior in creating more housing and more affordability, which we all believe in, and things that respect local home rule and local control and local voters, and fight back hard against the bad proposals as well. But a lot of it will depend on the composition of the state legislature after this election. Certainly, there was less incentive to pass more aggressive legislation this year in a short session because of the time, but there's also less incentive because it's an election year. And I think a lot of people understand that the one size fits all usurpation of local control and input is not viewed favorably by the people whose local input is being taken away. And so a lot will depend on everything that happens between now and January, which includes an election. So it remains to be seen, but there's no reason to expect that all of these proposals and more, but especially fair share with the calculations being released in the beginning of next year, I believe. There's no reason to expect that all of these things will not be back.
And it remains to be seen how that calculation will be done. But what's come clear to me is that now in the bill that ended up getting passed at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning, they said that only units, three plus units of multifamily count as density development. So when you consider that so many towns have gentle density where you have, let's say, a number of townhomes all right next to each other, and those are sort of situated usually right around a town center because it's usually in an area where there's sewer usually, or and they can have some more density in that way. None of those are going to count when they start doing these allocations per the language that's in the bill. Now, it remains to be seen how they do that calculation, but we're going to be looking very closely at how that's done because, we have to, put a flag on that play because it makes no sense because you're not counting density that already exists, and you can't have such extreme density again in these smaller towns that you can do when you have so much more infrastructure in a larger city area, with wider roads and on-street parking. And so it's very important that we all pay very close attention to this and get in touch with your legislators. Let them know where you stand on this. Make sure they know that you are going to hold them accountable if they're not going to do the right thing, if they're not going to go forward and stand up for the rights of your community, because that's why it's representative government. They're supposed to represent their towns and their cities.
And
Yeah.
one just quick thing, be aware of that even though early next year we're supposed to hear about the fair share proposal, they haven't even announced yet who their consultant is based upon my very recent communications, let alone announce anybody they're going to populate on this working group. So the time is ticking down. So almost certainly what was said last session that we're going to just see a cold rehash of what was already proposed likely will be the path of least resistance to just bring up again to the legislature. So this is a time to continue to watch what's going on. And also it's a time to see what we can do working with people, even folks who I may not have agreed with some of the bills this session. I'm happy to work with them and happy to work with people regardless of which party they're in or which chamber they're in. This is a good opportunity, but we want the public to not just wait until the next legislative session. And as Senator Fazio said, there's a lot that can happen between now and when the next session is, including and especially the composition of the legislature, which could have a big impact on what happens at committee levels and then when things are hashed out in the chambers for votes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Edward, go ahead, Catherine.
I was just going to say what's concerning and also a little surprising is the sort of rampant focus on unbridled development at the expense of environmental protection and open space preservation. There is absolutely no focus. When you drill down into the details of these bills, even as they get amended over and over again, no one who cared about open space preservation, historic preservation, anything that's not already protected, they didn't work on them. And fair share, I think, will put everything on steroids. So fair share, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is they start with one number. And what I keep hearing is like around 90,000. We need 90,000 new units of affordable housing. I don't know where that number comes from. And I don't comprehend it. I've seen that it has to do with the amount of people in the state that pay more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. But how does that translate into we need to build 90,000 new units because they already live somewhere? So I don't understand that logic. But aside from that, then that gets allocated among the 8 or 9 COGs, which are regional areas. And then within the COG, if you have too high of a grand list and not enough multi-housing, you get a big fair share. And I think CT 169 did a great analysis when this was being put up last year. So the first half of fair share passed, which is simply doing the calculation. The other half didn't pass, which is imposing that mandate on the towns. That could pass next time. But when CT 169 did the calculation, Maria had a massive spreadsheet where you could look up your town and see based on what they were saying a year ago, what it would have been. It could be that towns would have to double their housing to generate that amount of affordable that would be imposed on them. The central planning concept just doesn't work with land use, and the environment will suffer.
Yeah.
And that's on
Um,
our website, so anybody wants to look at their fair share numbers, they did not pass twice when they showed the numbers. They did not pass. And this past year, when fair share was like, oh, it'll just be a study, we'll let you know what the numbers are later, that passed. So, you know, that's the concern about work, live, ride as well, you know, the desegregate bill. The last couple of years where people asked questions and they had to give concrete answers about the kind of density, the bill never passed. But of course, this year they said, oh, it'll be OPM over 30 times named in the bill, who would be deciding all of the things, the final arbiter of your density, of your setbacks, of your height, of your square footage, everything. They would decide it all. And they just won't tell you what that is now. They'll just let you know sometime later when you have no option and you have no recourse at all, because they are the final arbiter. So
Yeah.
it was a bad bill, should never have passed. When you have the undersecretary of OPM saying that the bill is duplicative and not needed, when you have CCM saying that, Cost said that, we said that, you know, when even the majority leader roundtable, I know Ryan's on there, and you know, when they discussed all of the different programs that are out there for housing development, and they all said there are so many different programs that have conflicting requirements or different requirements, and it creates more confusion and challenge. So why would you pass another bill that makes it that much more complicated to get development done? And what CHFA was saying, the Connecticut Housing Financing Group head was saying, as well as OPM head was saying, was, you know, what we need is a little bit more latitude and flexibility to work directly with these communities. And we would welcome that. We would welcome that opportunity to have towns be able to work directly with the state and come up with good solutions that are focused on what works for the towns, and creates and hits the same desired goal that both the state has and these town has to create affordability. And that's the real solution here. It's not about creating these top-down mandates that are driven by housing advocates who are funded by developers. It's just not.
And
yeah.
one thing to
Maria,
remember is the people
oh,
of
go ahead.
Connecticut know best what's best for their communities because they
Yeah,
live there. And then
right.
state needs to recognize that and work with them. Absolutely.
Just go back to the fair share. I want to talk about, are there groups that could be, if you don't build your quote unquote fair share, would they have standing to sue that town if they're not building it? Is that what we're hearing?
That was what the original
Yeah.
bill that passed the Housing Committee in 2023 said. So,
Mhm.
you know, it's one thing to say you're going to lose your local zoning if you don't meet this requirement, which is actually much stricter and higher than 830G. But it also could give people standing to sue the municipality and make them potentially financially liable for building the housing themselves. So if you think your property taxes are high now, just wait until fair share passes, and it'll be coming out your ears, which ironically doesn't make housing a lot more affordable. So
Yeah,
you know, that in some instantiation is what you know, in a more minor, watered down version of that is in law in New Jersey. So yes, that was the original bill that passed out of Housing Committee in 2023. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It was a very bad idea then and now. And so that's my greatest fear. That is my, if you ask me what my greatest fear is, it's fair share and
Yeah.
something similar to its original form passing. I could not imagine a worse law. I mean, I just couldn't. It's downright Soviet, and it's so unfair. It's so counterproductive, and it's so adversarial that it'd make your head spin. But this was voted out of the Housing Committee in 2023. So
Right.
this is what you got to be concerned about. At the same time, we did some good bipartisan things this year. So the
Absolutely.
possibility of doing good things in bipartisan fashion and meeting the needs of communities and also the needs of the housing market at the same time, these things are doable. The range of outcomes from good to really, really unbelievably bad are pretty wide. And this is all of them are still possible in the coming years. So that's why we need to be working really hard and really vigilantly, and reach out an open hand to people who sometimes disagree with us, but at the same time be ready to fight against something that's really bad that might come forward.
Yeah, and Maria, with that said, I know you we have a call to action as CT 169 because please know that we are not resting. The summer may be here, but we are not taking a holiday because this matters to so many people. I talk to people of all political stripes, and they are concerned because our suburbs here in Fairfield County have had to deal with the implications of 830G of housing that just doesn't really work. So Maria, I will give it to you and tell us how people can get more engaged and activated.
Sure. So if you're willing to get engaged, we are looking to have captains in every one of our 169 towns to work with us as a liaison. So just reach out to us and we would be happy to recruit you. We would just ask you to then share the information within your community. Let us know what's going on in your community, what we can do to help. So we want more direct contact with each of these 169 towns. We do have quite a bit of different friends of and followers of CT 169 Strong from throughout the state, from all ends of the state, which is great. So we're just encouraging that more, because the best thing that we can do is with the funding that we receive is we put out more information. We do advertising that's directly to residents in our state, and to have them understand what's in the bills, because really what we see is the ones who propose these bills talk about everything but what's actually written in the bills. And the housing advocates talk about what they'd like the bills to say, but not actually what's in the bills. So we've been very adamant about putting out factual information, letting people know what's in the language in the bill, what the implications are, and making sure that everyone is aware of that, because it's with awareness that our residents can get engaged and reach out to their legislators and tell them, no, this does not work for us. And you represent us, and it's time for you to vote the right way. So that's what we need. We need everybody to be strong and to do that. So donations help, volunteering helps. We need all those things. So we hope you want to get engaged and just let us know.
Yeah, and we appreciate obviously Senator Fazio and Senator Gordon so much for your time. But a lot of legislators from all different backgrounds we do have conversations with, and that's really important. That collaboration is really key. That's how we can have good results and good policy for our state. So thank you guys. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you to our wonderful audience. We will be sending the video out of this session, and look out for more webinars coming up this summer. We will be here, and thank you. Have a good night. Please visit our website at ct169strong.org. A link is provided in the description to this video. Please support our efforts on behalf of your neighborhood and to preserve local control of zoning. Thank you.